Hi, loves. Okay, I'm actually quite excited to record this podcast this morning because it's something I've been meaning to do for a while. And it's also something that I've hesitated to do for an even longer time, is to tell my personal story of how I got into this work in the first place, more publicly. But what I've been realizing is that like I'm basically doing like back-to-back interviews these last few weeks of folks who are applying for our level one grief tending and ritual facilitation training fall cohort, which starts on September 15th. And sitting in these interviews, I'm like, almost everybody wants to know, like, how did you end up doing what you're doing, right? Because like, as you know, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you know this, like nobody gets into grief work because they're just like happily skipping down the path. And then there's a sign that says grief work, and they're like, oh, that would be an interesting thing to explore, right? It's just, it doesn't really work that way. It's more like you're like happily skipping down the path, at some point in your life, whether you're like an infant just born or, a very old person, you're happily skimming down the path. And then something out of the blue just comes and like absolutely slams you to the ground. And then you're crawling for quite a few miles through like a very thorny, painful path. And then eventually you learn how to, hopefully, if you're lucky to have the resources and support and around you to support you through this, that eventually you're lucky to be able to come back to standing and start to be able to navigate a path through the grief that is brings you into a relationship with grief, where grief can become a companion to you and not just something that is feels like it's destroying your life. So all that to say that we all know that we don't get here by accident. And I certainly didn't get here by accident. And so, yes, I do have a story to share about that. And yeah, so I think we'll just dive in from there. So, to start at the beginning, well, where is the beginning, right? Because we can time travel, we can go back to the womb, we can go back, to conception, we can go back even preconception, perhaps to the lifeline of our soul and you know past lives or our ancestral lineage. And so there's many different places that we could start and call it the beginning. But I will say that my ancestral lineage is um, mostly Irish, with also a large portion of English and Scottish, and a little bit of French from when ancestors of mine during the French Revolution fled France and came to England. So yeah, there's quite a mix of history in there. One thing that I think has significantly impacted my ancestry and continues to impact my family lineage to this day is the genocide of the Irish that happened in the mid 1800s, also known as the potato famine. And during this time, it was not just a lack of food; it was a forced lack of food, because there was a tremendous amount of food being exported by the English lords to England and to other places, while the Irish people's potato crops were failing, and they were they had been living on the brink of starvation under colonization for quite some time, before the potato famine even happened. And when the potatoes had this disease and came up from the ground, like basically not edible, just destroyed, moldy, uh, inedible. It was said that there was cries, screams of agony sounding all across Ireland, because people were already starving when they were preparing to harvest their crop of potatoes for that year. Because the food was so limited, they had so little already. So there's many years leading up to that time. And then the way that it was handled by um, the the colonizers, the English at that time, was to, continue to export all the, the meat and all the different types of food that were also grown in Ireland on the English farms. And so it really was just a process, a part of the process of the colonization of Ireland, the genocide of the Irish people. And during that time, my family came to Pennsylvania, and yeah, and I think that the impact of leaving the land that is the land of your family, your community, your ancestors, and I think many of us in North America can't even understand, what was lost in that leaving. Um, and also what was the experience of the ones who stayed as well, and the huge suffering that they endured in order to be able to stay. But the leaving, there's a type of soul loss that happens in the leaving of the ancestral homelands. Um, and Francis Weller talks somewhat about this when he talks about the five gates of grief. That fourth gate of grief, that which we expected and did not receive. We don't even remember anymore, right? We don't even remember as second, third, fourth, fifth generation um, children and grandchildren of the ones who left their ancestral homeland. We don't even remember what was lost at this point because it's so distant, right? And in many cases, the stories weren't told of what was lost because there was such grief, there's such unprocessed grief there, for one thing, that it couldn't even be spoken of. And in the case of the Irish and many other people who came to this land from different places, they want to hide their identity in order to be able to fit in, because certainly the Irish were seen as lesser than, and so that was also a very painful thing. And I believe that trauma, continues to impact my lineage and is perhaps um, part, if not all, the reason why I had the childhood experience that I did. So yeah, so the ancestry and and then the my ancestors being a part of the colonization that happened on this land, and I don't know a lot of the details about that, but I do know that they lived here and they were living during that time when residential schools were happening, when the indigenous population here was being absolutely decimated. And so, you know, whether they were actually taking part in that or whether they were standing alongside it and not intervening in it, we're all accomplice to oppression, unless we are standing directly in the way of it. So that is a part of my history as well, and especially a part of my, the English ancestors that would have come over and would have, owned uh, some of my first English ancestors that came here owned a hotel in the Cusp in the Kootenay region, and that was not their land, of course, but it was given to them by the colonial forces that were governing there at that time. So yeah, so without getting too deep into that, that is a whole piece that certainly has impacted my life, and something that I consider very deeply. Um, I was, fortunate to grow up with a mother who was very deeply connected to nature, and also very aware of the colonial system and the residential school trauma. Unfortunately, I probably got educated about that at too young of an age, like long before I was developmentally ready to understand, that level of trauma. But so I was exposed to a tremendous amount of vicarious trauma at a very young age. And I was also exposed to my mother's mental illness in the form of something that hasn't been formally diagnosed, but probably borderline personality disorder. And I think also probably bipolar, that was impacted by her menstrual cycle. And so and I grew up with just her as a single parent. And my dad was not in the picture. They were together for a very brief period of time, basically conception only, um, which happened in a bar. Yeah. And then, he wasn't in the picture for many years. which, part of me understands why, because it was quite a chaotic picture. And I think it would have been very hard to participate in that. But also, he did leave a child in that picture, and that was me. And so little me experienced a tremendous amount of chaos, a tremendous amount of violence, um, a tremendous amount of, yeah, just heavy duty trauma. It was basically like growing up in my own little mini war zone. And I think, the gift of that is it gives me so much compassion and empathy for people who are, in situations of, the absolute worst kind of conditions of trauma, genocide, war zone, torture, this kind of thing. It's like I feel that very deeply and empathize with it. And I was really lucky that, my surroundings, I had the nature connection piece from my mom and from where she placed us, our environment. And, I grew up in a beautiful place surrounded by, gardens and wild and forest. And when I was a teenager, I had horses, which was such a gift. We moved to a place where my neighbor had horses, and she just like welcomed me right in. And horses are incredible teachers. They're incredible teachers of empathy and attunement, because they're so highly attuned, they're so sensitive, and they communicate, of course, with body language only, like all animals. But there's something really magic about horses and the way that they, even being such large animals, welcome and accept humans in their field, and are willing to be in relationship with us in that way. It's really, really special. And so, yeah, I was really, really blessed with that relationship. And I think that taught me, those horses that I was able to interact with and have in my care really taught me a lot about love and, the heart field and uh, relationship and attunement and safety and boundaries and so many things. And so, yeah, I'm super, super grateful for that time that I had. I don't have horses in my world these days, but that time really, really influenced, who I am as a person and as someone who is, in the field of facilitating healing work. So really, really grateful for that time and influence. Yeah, and I had dogs as well and other animals, and yeah, just really grateful for, the Buddha has said to be said, has said to be quoted as of saying, if you want to learn how to love, start with plants and animals because they're easier, right? They're easier than humans. And so I think even though I was in a very traumatic relational field with my mom and also many of the humans in my life, because I think I just didn't know how to interact with people, kids in school and stuff like that because of the abuse I was experiencing at home. So it was very difficult for me to be in relationship with other peers my age, especially within the colonial system, which of course encourages all kinds of toxic behavior. Um, but yeah, I had animals, and I was really lucky to have a couple of really close friends, especially particularly my best friend Deirdre, who just like took me on and like really, yeah, we just had a beautiful relationship, and we're still friends today. So I'm so grateful for her. And yeah, I feel like I had a tremendous amount of hardship, but I also had a tremendous amount of grace, and I'm always so grateful to, yeah, the grace of just meeting the right people at the right time on my journey. So yeah, so I left home quite early, 16. I was 16 when I moved out. Hadn't graduated, and I finished high school living in my own apartment. And yeah, I pretty quickly moved away from my hometown and out to the west coast of Vancouver Island, and was blessed to be drawn into healing work right away. I had a friend who I was working with, and we were working together and surfing together, and she'd done a ton of traveling. She's about 10 years older than me, and she had just recently come back from India, where she'd been studying yoga and Reiki. And so I got to go through this Reiki initiation with her and dive deep into yoga, and that really, I think, started to change me and change the course of my life. I was drawn just like deeply into it and deeply into lucid dreaming in that time when I was living on the West Coast and being in the ocean, and it definitely had a heavy influence in my on my life and path. Soon after that, I got into doing bodywork massage and eventually craniosacral therapy, and was mentored for many years by Elizabeth Clareper, who, if you join our community, you will meet her because, yeah, we've been working together for now almost 20 years, and she teaches the meditation for nervous system regulation and emotional healing practice, which is a monthly guided group within our grief support group community. So yeah, I was really blessed to meet her. And she was, I think, the first person, the first human who really understood what was happening in my nervous system and helped me start to be able to navigate that in a way where, yeah, I started to have real healing happen in my system, receiving craniosacral work from her and kind of being guided by her in the work that I was offering. I was working at Hollyhock Retreat Center, and so seeing tons of people, 5, 6 people every day who were there for healing, so it was a really profound container to be able to work in and offer this very deep nervous system healing work in the form of craniosacral therapy and of course, tremendous amount of insights coming through for people and just breakthroughs, and it was really, really powerful. But eventually, what I started to realize is that I was doing this really deep work with people, and it was the nervous system work, but it was also, there was a psychology aspect to it, and I didn't have that training, and so I wanted to get more training in, trauma-informed care and kind of basic counseling skills. And that's when I did my training with Mariah Moser at Opening to Grace and her relational somatic therapy training. And which is where I met my husband, Davis, who you will meet at some point soon, I think, because we're going to have him on here. And yeah, so that training was incredible. Just Mariah is such a gift to the world and to the somatic world, especially because I think, I chose her training because I was seriously considering doing somatic experiencing training, but understanding that that was more focused on shock trauma, which is of course really powerful body of work. But I've always been really interested in relationship and in relational healing. And so the relational somatic therapy, where we were learning attachment work and developmental trauma and all of those things was, as well as the shock trauma, was really, really what I was interested in. And it was around that same time period that I was also deeply involved in nature connection community in BC, where I live on the coast, and um, yeah, being taught by John Young and his body of work, the deep nature connection and bird language and tracking and primitive skills and all these kind of things had always been something that was interesting to me. And the bird language and nature connection piece was really starting to open for me because I was starting to see the threads between tracking and bird language and nature connection and somatic nervous system healing. Like how when our nervous systems get connected to nature, all these different somatic practices that are being taught in the field of SE, for example, somatic experiencing, they're actually nature connection practices, but they've been removed, right, and kind of colonized, let's say, because they've been removed from their origins, which is that deep nature connection. And I think that's really significant because I think when we are grounded in our connection with nature, in our connection with the land where we literally physically live, so not in like a kind of etheric, like what's the word, not in just in theory, but in actual practice of like being in relationship with the land and with the birds and with the water and with the animals where we live. When we're in actual relationship with that, um I just, that is a necessary component to healing, is absolutely necessary component to healing. If we're doing spiritual work or healing work and we're not connected to the land, there's something that is missing. Okay. And so I was deeply involved in this body of work, and the whole community around it, particularly on Salt Spring Island, where Jean-Claude and Ingrid run the Wisdom of the Earth School, and they run a year-long immersion for adults, and they also run a kids program. It's 3 days a week, and the kids are just like fully. There's no indoor space. They're outside 24/7, all day, winter, rain, shine, snow, hail, whatever it is. They're out there with a little. They have a tarp, basically. So my son was in that program from the age of, I think he was 9 until he was 14. And so he was in that program, and we were having these regional gatherings once a year in the summer. And so people were coming from all over the Pacific Northwest, even as far east as Wyoming and Montana, and yeah, people coming from California, all over. And we were having these gatherings of about 150 people coming from all over, and I was on the staff, and we had quite a large staff because, we basically, the intention of the gathering was to create like a pop-up kind of nature connected village for 7 days, where we're doing primitive skills, we're doing tracking, we're doing bird language, nature connection, play, lots of play, and like really opening the nervous system, right? And because of my background in somatic work and therapy and healing work, and also because not very good at primitive skills. So the suggestion was like, why don't you can hold the grief tending space? Because what they had recognized in this body of work at this point, and especially with these gatherings, is that when people get connected to themselves, to each other, in nature, when they start to get really deeply connected in that way, what happens is they actually hit this wave, or this wall of grief comes forward, because they start to recognize all the ways that they have not been connected, right? And so there's all this grief of these basically lost parts of themselves. And so we set up this tent. And in other gatherings like this, let me preface this by saying that in other gatherings like this, they would have on the East Coast, and actually in California as well, they would have like a sacred fire, which is a Lakota practice, a grief tending practice. And we weren't able to have that on the land where we were, because it was so dry, and two, there wasn't anybody there who was trained in holding that. And so instead we created this tent, and it was kind of like, just do something with it, and not a lot of guidance around it. And so I set up this tent. I had water. We couldn't smudge, so we had water with cedar boughs, and just kind of, a space where people could come in and be with their grief, and be with the water bowls, and be with the cedar, and I was tending that space, and to my utter astonishment, it became like a revolving door 24/7 of people coming through this space, just one after another. And I'd be going to get food, my meals, and people would be approaching me and looking for support. And so I was pretty blown away, because I had no idea, that there was so much grief, and that there would be so much grief in a space like this. And so it really opened my eyes. And after the second year of doing this, so it's a 7-day gathering, and by the end of the 7 days, I was just like flat out exhausted, like on my back, just like, hold me, earth, like I can't move or speak anymore, or hold any more space, and just like, whoa, so tired. And so what I started to see is, I was like, there has got to be a way to scale this. There's got to be a way of bringing this grief tending into the community space at large, rather than doing it one-on-one, because it's just not sustainable, for one thing. And two, wow, like everybody here has grief. So why are we not like acknowledging that as a collective group? And so I started to look around, and like look for like, okay, who's doing this? Who's doing grief ritual? Who's doing community grief spaces? And what does that look like? And that was when I discovered Francis Weller's work. And if you're not familiar with Francis's work, his first book is The Wild Edge of Thoreau, where he articulates the 5 gates of grief. He's an incredible writer and speaker and just so poetic. And he's also a psychotherapist and has run many grief rituals. He worked for many years with Malidoma and Sabanfu Some, who are both from the Daigara tribe in West Africa and who came to North America to bring the traditional Daigara grief ritual because the elders sent them saying this medicine is needed in the West in North America. It is people are their hearts are blocked and they need this. And so they were sent, and Francis connected with them, and they started to work together. Eventually, Francis and eventually Malidoma and Sabanfu split up, and they started to work separately. And then eventually, Francis and Malidoma parted ways because Francis really wanted to bring the work into a form that he felt was more available for Western people, and Malidoma really wanted to keep it traditional, is the story that I've heard. So they parted ways. There may have been some other factors involved there that we won't get into, but anyways, I was very blessed to be able to go down and sit with Francis in California, basically right before COVID. I think this was 2018. And yeah, to get to spend a weekend with him and be in these many different grief tending practices and the full grief ritual as well. And it was so beautiful and powerful. And I will say of him, there's many kind of people who've become famous leaders in the wellness and healing industry and are not, I think, not in integrity and serving wholeness, and who are kind of like have a strong shadow side that they haven't worked with. And what I saw is that Francis is somebody who is constantly working to integrate his shadow, and he's really the real deal. So I had a beautiful experience there, and I'm really, really grateful for his body of work and what I got to learn from being in his space. And then since then, I've taken several different courses and trainings with him. So definitely what I'm doing is heavily influenced by his work. And then the other thing that I encountered around the same time was my friend Eliza Lee, who still is in Vancouver, and she was at the time offering something called the Truth Mandala in Vancouver, which is a part of the body of work of Joanna Macy, who is now an ancestor. She crossed over last summer, and in her 90s, she is an incredible powerhouse. Like, what an amazing ancestor to have guiding us. And her body of work is very, very profound. And the Truth Mandala is kind of at the heart of it, and it's a beautiful grief ritual, and that works with elements, and one person goes to the center at a time and works with the elements to express their grief, and everyone else is just witnessing. And so that is the core ritual that we now work with. I found out Eliza was doing it, and I went and sat with her in Vancouver, and it was a really profound experience as well. And I knew after sitting with that's the type of ritual that I want to hold, because I love it, because it's a bit more contained than kind of the traditional Daigara ritual, or even the style that Francis Weller holds. I think it's just more practical to scale, because the Daigara style ritual, you need a lot more people facilitating because there's just a lot more going on. It's like a bit more chaotic. Whereas the Truth Mandala is like, two facilitators can definitely hold that. And I love it because there's witnessing woven into it. And I think as Westerners, we really need witnessing is a really important part. Witnessing and being witnessed is a really important part of healing and working with grief, because we carry so much shame in the West. We carry so much shame, and that's actually like a big barrier to healing. So yeah, so those were big influences on me, and I started to offer grief ritual. And actually, the first ritual that I offered was inside of the somatic therapy training that I was doing with Mariah, because we had an opportunity to bring forward an offering to our group that are a cohort that we were learning with. And so it was really great to just have that opportunity to kind of offer something and be held in that container. And it was very profound. And I knew, from doing that, I knew like, wow, this is it. This is what's going to happen. And it was kind of amazing because I was in a room, my cohort was pretty much like everybody else in my cohort. There was maybe like one other person besides me who wasn't like super deeply immersed in ayahuasca and like the psychedelic world at that time. And the feedback that I got from the grief ritual, people were like, wow, that was as powerful as like any ayahuasca or psychedelic experience that I've ever had. And at that time I have now at this point had a experience with ayahuasca that was very, yeah, profound and healing. And so I understand what they mean, but at that time I was like, wow, okay, cool. And it's pretty amazing to be able to, offer something where we don't need medicines, those kind of medicines, but we can still have a really profound experience. And so I started offering grief rituals regularly at that point in my home in Salt Spring Island at the time, and then about twice a year we'd have a bigger kind of regional or community ritual that people would come from all over the region. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, well, is what happened. That got completely shut down during COVID because of course we couldn't even gather within our community anymore, let alone like within our region, having people coming from all over. And so when that happened, I mean, I think for not just me, but for many people, that was a time of profound, kind of shifting and recalibrating to like, okay, like what do we do, in this context? And I was really stuck because I thought, everyone's moving their work online. And I just thought, there's no way that we can move grief ritual work online because it's so powerful. Like you can't you can't bring people into that depth of space when you're not like physically in the room with them, like safely. And so and I was listening to what Francis Weller was saying too, and he had said multiple times and was continuing to say through COVID, like you cannot bring grief ritual work online. And I agreed with that. So I was really sitting with what to do. And then I just thought, maybe what we can do is not bring the ritual work online, but maybe bring in some of the other elements and have kind of like a support group where people can come together and share their experience, share what they're going through, learn some somatic tools and skills, learn some of the writing practices, the journaling practices, the portals, as we're starting to call them, or shuttles, is what Francis Weller calls them, the writing practices. And just, yeah, some of these tools and kind of starting to teach about, what I know about grief and give people context for their experience. And so yeah, so I was like, well, let's give that a go, and it'll be better than nothing, right? And it ended up turning out that it was like incredible, actually, and that it was actually all of a sudden I was seeing this piece that I'd been missing when I was offering just the grief ritual work. Because with the ritual work, it's so powerful, and people would come and have this profound, life-changing experience. But then how do they stay connected to each other as a community? How do they integrate what they've experienced into like their day-to-day life? How do they continue to allow the work to unfold? Where's the support system around that? And I had started to kind of see that, but then when we moved online, I was like, oh, this is it. This is it. There's so much we can do online. There's so much we can do that isn't that super cathartic work, but it's actually the foundation underneath of it. And so, yeah, so that ended up being a really amazing pivot. And then after COVID ended, we kind of just, I did that through COVID, and I was doing a lot of one-on-one work at that time as well. And then after COVID, I started to teach the training. And yeah, because pretty much almost as soon as I started offering grief ritual, people were coming to me and saying, can you teach me how to do this work? Because I want to bring it into the people who are defending the forest and going through all this trauma around fighting these logging companies, and people who are, fighting for indigenous causes, and people, there's so much grief, right? When we're working towards creating the world that we want to live in, we're in that it is a battle, right? And there is harm that's happening, and then just like day-to-day life too, and then losses, personal losses, this kind of thing. So there's such a need for it. And people were, and I was seeing that right away, but of course I was like, well, no, I barely even know this. I definitely can't teach it. But at that point after COVID, we were like 4 years in, and so, or 3 years in, I guess, 4 years in, and I felt good. I felt confident about, sharing, kind of helping people learn to do what I was doing. And yeah, I also think teaching is one of the best ways that we learn, or we integrate our learning, and we always learn through offering. And so it's something that I've always been pretty excited about. And yeah, so then we started this grief tending and ritual facilitation training. And it's been a little bit of a bumpy road the first couple of years, for a lot of learning for sure, but still really profound. And just wow, what incredible experiences we had with those first couple of cohorts. And yeah, and I think now we're moving into our fifth cohort as we move towards the fall of 2026. And I'm just so excited because yeah, it feels like at this point we have something that's just really solid structure, really profound depth. And we had, the way that we have it set up now is there's a level 1 training, which is all online. And there's two reasons why we do it like that. One, because it really allows it makes it so much more accessible, right? The first time we offered the online only training, we had like, actually the majority of the people who joined that were Black women and women of color. And so I was like, wow, this is doing the job. I'm getting it into these communities where it's, really, really needed, and wouldn't necessarily be accessible if people were having to, pay for the whole level 1 and level 2 at the same time, and, buy plane tickets and be able to travel. There's Selena did the training, and she had just had a baby that year, and she was able to like be with her baby and be at home and be in the training. So the accessibility is one factor. And the other factor is that one thing that I was finding with the training before we had it split into level 1 and level 2 is that it's really an initiation when you step into this training, because it is such profound, deep work. It's not just learning how to do things, learning skills and structures, although that is a big part of it, but it's also really going inside of yourself and looking at your own, ancestral lineage, ancestral trauma, your own places of untended grief, untended, where maybe you feel like you don't belong fully, or you're not welcome, or these, the wounded child parts that maybe haven't been fully tended to. Working with how to be in community, how to be in group together, how to hold ethical space, how to hold ethical space for a group, and then how to hold ethical space for a diverse group, right? Which is a whole other level. Yeah, looking at all the 6 gates of grief, not just that first gate of, major loss and bereavement, but also looking at, all the other levels of grief, and how is that in your body, right? When you look at it, because even those who've done, really advanced somatic training and are working somatically with people, but how does it show up in your body when somebody brings something to you around ancestry, or around colonialism, or around, harm that's actively happening in the colonial landscape we live in right now, grief that they're experiencing around that harm. How do you be that with that in your body, right? And so being able to really build capacity to hold not just groups, but diverse groups, and just to be in the work it's a profound thing, right? And it's deep, and not everybody's ready for it. And so having the training split into level 1 and level 2, it really acts as kind of it's a threshold, right? And it's a second threshold to be able to And some people need to complete the level one and then take a big old break, to really integrate that before moving into the deeper ritual, in-person ritual space holding. And some people are just like ready to go right into it afterwards. So, like really primed and ready to step into that ritual work and the next level of personal healing as well that comes with the ritual work. So yeah, so it's been really, really good to have it set up that way, and where there's more than one threshold to cross coming in, and yeah, we get to be together in different ways and different spaces and different ways of holding the work. So yeah, I think that is all I'm going to say today about myself and the work. And I mean, I actually maybe I'll finish by saying I had this great question from someone who's just registered for the training in the interview process. When I meet for an interview with somebody, it's like I'm asking you questions, but you also get to ask me questions. And so sometimes I get some really great questions, and then it informs me, where people are curious about me, or what questions are kind of out there. And I love that she asked me, what is my current edge? And I love this question because, I think part of the reason I've been afraid to, or not afraid to, but hesitant to record my story in this way, either in, verbally like this on here or by writing it down, is because I feel like our stories are constantly evolving. And so I don't want my story to become this like edifice, because I know it's going to change. Not that the story will change, but that my perception of the story will change. And as it does, as we heal, our perception of the story is constantly shifting. And yeah, and so I would say, like, my current edge right now that I'm working with in myself is really about um, this kind of deeper level of healing that can happen when we allow ourselves to drop perfectionism, drop striving, drop working so hard, um, and really rest into the field that supports this work, right? The field that supports healing, the field that supports depth and understanding and growth and learning together. I think in the past me really did work hard and had to work hard. I had to work hard from a very young age just to exist and survive in the field that I was born into, and it has taken a tremendous amount of work to get this whole body of work formed in the world, as the Dark Woods of Grief and the incredible community and layers of support that we have around us now. There's been some integral people like Dr. Jane Spielman, who came through our very first cohort, and she's never left, and she's just like has my back. And and Tekka Thompson, who's running the Black women's group along with Audrey and Selena, and just is teaching me so much about rest and allowing and magic and manifestation and how to hold a field of that field of diversity is of holding a good field for diversity. It's not about perfection, it's about love, right? And so I'm so grateful for that, and just all our incredible like we have such an incredible team of facilitators, of interns now here, and just watching people drop deeper and deeper into their own sense of safety and letting go into that container of support has been so profound. And so also allowing myself to do the same, right? Allowing myself to be supported by the body of work and by all the structures and systems that I've created. And then what's so cool is the more that I allow myself to do that, the more that you and the people who come into this container can allow themselves to soften and open and relax and rest and drop perfectionism, and to do that, because we have to do that if this work is going to be sustainable long term. We can't be aiming for perfection in the spaces we hold. There's always going to be misattunements and mistakes and, and learning. And the more that we can just relax into that, then the more profound of a space we can hold, and the more our own nervous systems can be just, you know, uh, well and juicy and alive and connected, but also, flexible and resilient in our work and in these spaces. So yeah, I would say that is my current edge, and I'm so excited about it, and I'm so grateful for, yeah, just the incredible support that is around that. I'll also name Kat Wilson, who comes in and supports our level 2 training retreats, and just her, she really embodies that that what I'm talking about is that edge, what is at my edge right now, and what is, her love, her place of mastery. So yeah, and I think that is such a lesson as well, that I want to pass on to everybody that just comes into my field, is that we're not meant to do this alone. We're meant to work as a community, as the organism of the community, because none of us, just like the body, each cell in the body and each organ in the body has its own role. Each one of us has its own role in the community system, right? And we wouldn't ask the liver to do the job of the stomach, right? Or vice versa, because they're good at different things. And so having that organic system is super important. And that's what I'm excited to help people who come through the training, who come into our community, to build for themselves, or to find, so that so that we can just have more and more wholeness through this work, and through the layers of support that get created through that. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. And I would love, 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 like, it would be such a gift back to me if you could leave me feedback, just, any insights, any ahas, any, just, how listening to this may have supported you or helped you, because that feedback is like so deeply nourishing to me. Sometimes being on the internet can be this weird thing where you're like speaking into the void, and there's no response, no kind of comments below. And then you connect with people one on one, and they're like, "Oh, I listened to that podcast. It was so amazing. Thank you so much." And I'm like, "Why didn't you say something in the comments?" Would have been really nice to hear that. So this is my ask back to you. If you feel a desire for generous reciprocity in that way, I'd love to hear from you in the comments here below. And if you're interested in the training, obviously I'd love to hear from you via either an application, or reach out via email, and we can book a time to chat. Applications are open now and will close August 28th. We start on September 15th. There is a chunk of pre-study, pre-preparation work that you can do. So the sooner that you get enrolled, the better. If you're somebody who's here as a griever, we also have our amazing online grief support group, as well as our Return from the Underworld course. And that community is profoundly amazing as well. So I encourage you to, just step in at whatever level feels right for you at this time. And I am so excited to meet you, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now.